Good day, students, and welcome to Theme 6, Project Risk Management. This theme is very simple in terms of the number of outcomes. So basically you need to define project risk management, and then you need to define and apply the project risk management process. Now the project risk management process has several steps that we will discuss in this presentation, and you will have to apply each step of the project risk management process. So here are the resources that you can use, and just so that you can see, we're now on project qualitative risk planning. We are only going to do qualitative risk planning, as the quantitative risk planning becomes a little bit more complicated and has a lot more calculations. And in a course of this nature, we just don't have the time to go into that properly in detail, as we only have 1 week to do the risk planning. Okay, so project risk, what we must remember is that when we talk about risk, it includes the potential benefits or opportunities that we get in the project, as well as hazards. So normally when we do project risk planning, our focus is on a risk of serious problems or failure. So the project not meeting performance requirements, schedule or budget. So you can see we're talking here about our iron triangle. And failure means that not meeting time, cost or performance targets by a predefined margin. So failure boils down to that we are not doing things the way that we planned to do things. Okay, so when we look at high risk or low risk, what is the risk of being struck by lightning, or what is the risk of getting a cold in winter? So if we look at the risk of being struck by lightning, the probability of that happening is very low. So the chances of me walking outside when it's raining and there's lightning and getting struck by lightning is low. But if I do get struck by lightning, the consequences are high, because I probably will die if I get struck by lightning. Whereas getting a cold in winter, the probability is high, because most people get a cold in winter, but the consequences are normally low, because not many people die from a cold that they get in winter, as long as they look after themselves. So you have to understand that with risk, we have these two concepts. The one is the probability, or the chances that it will happen, and then the other one is the consequences, or what is the impact of the risk on our lives. So here's some more examples. So if I travel by air, the probability that my aircraft will fall is 1 in a million. But the consequence of that happening is $1 million. All right, and the consequences is probably underrated over here, because because of the fact that it probably, in terms of lost income and the rescue effort and all of those things, the consequences are probably more than $1 million. So you can see the risk there is 1. Now, if I bought a scratch card, the probability of me winning is 99 in 100. If there are 100 scratch cards that are for sale and I buy one, and the consequence of buying the scratch card is $1. So the risk that I'm facing, or the opportunity that I have, is 0.99. So it's probably worth buying that scratch card. And so the conclusions that we can draw from this is that probability and consequence are both important. So just because something has a very low probability, if it has a high consequence, we have to pay attention to it. And you will see later on, when we get to the actual calculations, or the mapping of the risks, you will see that consequence and probability both play a role. Okay, so what is risk? It's an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on a project's objectives. So remember what we spoke about earlier, that there's also opportunity. So that would be the positive effect. And there are probably as many definitions as there are authors on risk. But the important thing to realize is that it has two dimensions: the probability of occurrence and the consequence of the risk. So risk is equal to probability times consequence. But be careful how you interpret it, because if it has a high consequence but a low probability, we still have to pay attention to it. Right, so some important things to know about risk is that risk always involves uncertainty. So, and risk also only exists for future events. So an event that has already occurred or is certain to occur is an issue, not a risk. So, for example, on projects in South Africa, one of the risks that is often identified is the fact that Eskom power will go off. Now, if you look at the load shedding cycle that is published online, and load shedding will take place on the 25th of December when you are having your Christmas party, then that becomes an issue for your Christmas party. It is not a risk because you know it is going to happen. Whereas if the load shedding schedule says that you are not going to, or that you will not be load shedded, the fact that Eskom power can go off it still remains a risk, because it is something uncertain that can occur in the future. All right, and obviously if something has already occurred, it's not a risk, it happened. And then the last thing is, some risks are a matter of perception. What is a risk to me might not be a risk to you. So if we take, for example, a wedding, and we have a bride whose image is very, very important to her, and it's very, very important to her that she looks beautiful on the day, and that her dress fits perfectly. So for her, if she picks up a kilogram or loses 5 kilograms and she no longer fits into her dress, that becomes a huge risk. Whereas another bride who maybe is more easygoing about her appearance and doesn't really care so much about what she looks like in the dress, and there are other things at the wedding that are more important to her, might not perceive the fact that she won't fit into the dress as a risk. Right, and then in the ideal world, this is what we want. We want to manage our risks on the project so that over our product life cycle, for example, if we're setting up a new production plant, our uncertainty, in other words, the number of risks are the highest at the start of the project during the feasibility study. And then when we plan, design and develop, we plan, design and develop in such a way so as to lower the risks and manage the risks, so that when we get to execution and start up and handover, our risks are a lot lower. And of course we want maintainability and reliability during operation, and so we want as few risks as possible. So this is if risks are managed properly. Right, so this is the risk management overview that comes from the PMBOK. And you can see that the PMBOK breaks risk management into 6 different steps. Plan risk management, identify risks, perform qualitative risk analysis, perform quantitative risk analysis, plan risk responses, and then control risks. Now, for this course, we are going to use a tailored risk management process, which basically hinges around defining the project. Now, defining the project is what I taught you in the first semester with PJP 4080. So, in other words, the planning of the schedule, planning of the scope, and then also planning of the cost. So that has to be in place. Then we identify the risks, we evaluate the risks. The evaluation of the risks is necessary so that we can decide which risks are the most serious and which risks should we plan for. Then we develop risk responses, we identify the risk owners, we draw up a list of risks, and then at the end of the day, we manage, or as the PM Bok will have it, we control the risks. Okay, so the following minimum project planning must be put into place to have defined the project. So we need a work breakdown structure, we need a schedule, and we need a budget. So as soon as we have those three components for our project, we can start with our risk management process. Now, remember that all of these planning documents and planning processes will happen iteratively. So as we maybe do our risk planning, we might identify work breakdown structure or schedule or budget issues that we didn't think about. And remember, an issue is something that will happen and that we need to actually include in the plan. It only is a risk if it's uncertain whether it's going to happen or not. Right. So here, the project was well planned and executed. The project was to take the dog hang gliding. I don't know if the dog is very happy, but the owner certainly is. All right, so then the first step is, after we've defined the project, is to identify the risks. Now, the project team must be called upon to identify project risks. Project risk management or project risk identification is not something which the project manager sits and does in isolation in his office. The reason for that is that different members of the project team have different specializations and also have different levels of experience. And the more people that are involved in the identification of the project risks, the more sure you are that all the risks will be identified. All right, then the risks are identified per WBS item. So you go through the WBS, and for each item you discuss what are the risks inherent in the item. Then what I normally do is I write the risks down on a post-it with the WBS item. And I will show this to you practically in class on Friday. And then also remember, as I've said before, it's an iterative process. So when I identify risks, I might identify items on the WBS, the schedule or the budget, which are not risks but are issues. And so that means I have to update my planning. Okay, so for identify risks, the main deliverable is the most comprehensive list of predictable known risks possible. Because remember, we can only identify known things that we know might happen. And at the end of the day, we want as many of those things as possible so that we can show that we've done due diligence. And at the end of the day, Murphy is alive and well, and you know, according to Murphy's law, if things can go wrong, they will. So in any project, there will always be things that happen that we did not predict or that we didn't plan for, and that's where the lessons learned comes in, and that's where the experience comes in. Right, so some inputs that we can use to help us to identify risks is lessons learned from similar projects, risk checklists that have been compiled in the company for different types of projects. Now, it's important that the risk checklist must be applicable to the type of project. And it is also important to not let the risk checklist make you think in the box, because in order to identify risks, you need to think outside the box. So you need to take the risk checklist as a first input, and then you have to think, for this specific project, what are any other risks that can happen. And then we've spoken about the project management plan, and then we can have certain risk categories, because that guides our thinking. System engineering documentation where applicable, and then using cause and effect diagrams will also help. And cause and effect diagrams, or Ishikawa diagrams, or fishbone diagrams, we have already spoken about in this course. Okay, so risk categories. So we would think about technical risks. So, for example, the design will not work, or the design is too bleeding edge, so the components won't be available, or the design is too old, so components will get obsolete too quickly. So those are the types of technical risks that we think about. Then cost risks, that would include things like exchange rates, the fact that a risk which organizations couldn't predict before Fukushima, when the nuclear plant blew up in Japan, was the fact that silicon components would become less readily available because of the fact that Japan went out of production for many, many months. So that had a cost and a schedule implication, but before Fukushima, that was an unknown, because nobody knew about that. But then after Fukushima happened, it became clear that it now would become risky for technological projects. And so those project managers that were managing technological projects at that stage either had to plan it in if they were still in the planning phase, or they would have to update their risk management plans based on the newest information during the management of risk. Right, and then there's programmatic risks. So things like scope changes, changes in the priority of the project, inadequate resources, incompetent staff, unreliable contractors, strikes, etc., etc. Right, then there are other risk categories, or there are further risk categories that we also look at. So the first one is internal risks, and then the second one is external risks. Now the main difference between the two is that internal risks can be controlled or influenced by the project team. So these are the things that you can mitigate, that you can make contingency plans around, etc., etc. Whereas external risks are beyond the control or influence of the project team, and for those risks you would like to transfer them, because you want somebody else to take responsibility if those things happen and if those things have a cost impact. Right, and then risk symptoms is basically warning signs that risks are going to start happening. So internal risk, technical risk is an internal risk. So this is the failure of the end item. This risk can be due to the nature of the end item or the process to create it. So it might be that the complexity is too high, the technological maturity is too low, there's low reliability, it's difficult to produce, or it's difficult to test. And then it also can be that if you have too much overlap of the project work, so you're trying to do too many things in parallel, you get high concurrency, and that then means that you are increasing the technical risk on your project. And you can see here we have our project's internal source of risk, and then we have our environment, which is the external source of risk. So external sources of risk are market conditions, government mandates, the physical environment. So the weather, for example, we have no control over the weather. And if the weather, if we're building a building and it rains for the next 6 weeks, there's basically nothing that we can do. We have no control over that. Geography is another interesting one. I always tell the story about a building at the CSR, Building 41, where the defense part of the CSR has always been situated. Now, because of the fact that it's the defense building, what happened when they constructed the building was that they needed to build an underground safe in order to house all the top secret and confidential documents that were used those years in the defense industry. So what happened when they built that building was they constructed the front part of the building where that safe was first. Then when they got to constructing the back part of the building, or the back half of the building, they found that there was a geographic problem in that there was a huge rock in the middle of where they needed to put the steps, in the middle of where the two buildings had to, or the two halves of the building had to join. And so then what happened was they decided that it was too expensive to remove the rock, and instead they then put the levels between the buildings at two different levels. So in other words, to get from the one side of the building to the other side of the building, you have to take a set of stairs. But what they didn't think about is that for the next 100 years, all technical components and all technical equipment that needed to be taken into the building, they needed to be carried up that set of stairs. So that's an example of poor risk management, because the wrong decision was taken, and that wrong decision impacts many, many years later. Right, then another external risk is labor and other resource availability. Project priorities, if the organization is managing projects in a strategic manner and somebody decides that the priority of the project has now dropped, that might mean that you don't get the resources that you need, and that your schedule now becomes later, or that it maybe costs you more money. And because that's part of the environment, it's external to the project, and it's very difficult for the project manager to manage. Then customer-supplier relationships, that's also external. And exchange rates. And we will talk about how to manage some of these risks later on. Okay, so we've spoken about the most comprehensive list of predictable known risks possible. So we can use checklists, which are tailor-made lists based on previous projects. But as I've said before, you must be careful that it doesn't limit your thinking, because you need to think out of the box. And you need to then supplement the checklists with other techniques, such as brainstorming or the Delphi technique. The other thing is to check your project assumptions. If you remember, when we do our project plan, we start by documenting assumptions in our project charter already. Now, assumptions are the things that we assume will be in place. So when we do our risk identification, we must go back to those assumptions and check that those things will actually be in place. Because if we, for example, assume that the client will approve a document within a 2 weeks time span, that has schedule and cost implications on our project. And if we then are busy with risk analysis, we then say, okay, but that's the assumption, so that's how it's going to happen. But we better just check at that stage with the client and say, is this assumption still correct? Because the client might come back and say, no, my workload has now increased, so I can no longer come back to you in 2 weeks, I can only come back to you in 3 weeks. And that then becomes a risk that we have to manage. And also ask leading questions. So what if that happens? And there it always helps to have a devil's advocate or a pessimistic person in the project team who will ask the difficult questions and will make everybody think further about what are the things that can possibly go wrong. And the use of an outside facilitator is often of value because firstly it frees the team up to just think about risks and not having to document risks. And also if you have an outside facilitator who is a experienced project manager, a person like that can also add value to the whole process. Right, so one of the techniques that we spoke about is the cause and effect diagram. So on this diagram we have a control system from our WBS. The risk is that it malfunctions, and we then look at what are the possible things that can lead to that risk materializing. And then there is also the failure mode and effect analysis, which is a much more detailed breakdown, which is done on every single item that the product is made up of in order to find out what causes failure in the product. Right, then we need to analyze risk, and risk is basically probability times consequence. That's the definition that we have of risk. But remember that we have to be cautious about this definition, because if something has a very high consequence, even though it has a very low probability, if it happens, it is a catastrophe. So, for example, when the trade center, the two buildings of the trade center collapsed, there was a firm in the trade center that had an office on both sides of the trade center. And so a risk analysis was done in terms of backing up their client information. Now, this firm, the nature of the work that they did was such that their client information was their life. And if they didn't have client information, the firm basically went under. So what happened was they did the risk analysis, and they then decided that the probability of both the towers collapsing at the same time was so low that they would not make backups off-site. They would only make backups between the two towers of their client information. Now, we all know what happened on 9/11. Both the towers collapsed, and the problem is that because they did not understand that the consequence was that the whole firm would go under, they didn't make a backup plan because they thought the probability was so low. And that's why we say that you have to be careful about this definition, and you have to be careful about how you interpret probability times consequence. And then remember that opportunities also have probabilities and consequences. So an opportunity can have a low probability, but if it happens, it has a high consequence, so we make lots of money and lots of profit. So then what we try and do is we try to increase the probability of that happening. So winning the lotto, it has a very, very, very low probability. I don't know how many of you buy lotto tickets every week, but the statisticians tell us that we have a higher chance of being hit by lightning than of winning the lotto. But when you win the lotto, you become an instant millionaire. And that is why people still play the lotto, because although the probability is so low, the consequence, the opportunity, if it happens, is very high. And then how do you increase your opportunity? You buy more numbers, because the more numbers you buy, the more you improve the probability that you will win. Right, so now, once we have identified the risks, the next step is that we need to evaluate our risks. So this is the diagram that we use to evaluate our risks. Now, you will see that on this diagram, we have impacts on the y-axis and we have probability on the x-axis. Now, when we do a qualitative risk analysis, we don't give numbers to the risks. All we do is we get a feel of the impact or consequence of the risk in terms of low, medium, and high, and we get a feel of the probability or the chance that the risk is going to happen in terms of low, medium, and high. And then, as we have discussed, if we have a low probability but a high impact, it means that it's a high risk, and it means that we need to then address the risk. Okay, so what we do, and we will do an example of this in class, is we then discuss the risks in the team, and we then decide whether it has a low, medium, high probability, a low, medium, high impact. And what I normally do is I draw this matrix on the board, and I then take my post-its where I've written my risks on, and I stick it on this matrix. So then I can see which are my high risks. And of course, in the next stage, where I then decide what to do about the risks, I treat all the highest, all the high risks. Okay, so the next step is then to treat the risks, or to respond or resolve the risks. So the previous step provides us with insight on how to respond. We know now which risks to respond to, and obviously all the high risks are the ones that we want to respond to, and the medium or low risks are the ones that we want to document and just keep an eye on, but we don't have to make plans on how to deal with them at this stage. And we also now know which opportunities we want to pursue, because if it is an opportunity with a high return or a high impact, then we want to pursue that opportunity. And we also then know which opportunities are not worth pursuing. Okay, so what I normally do to develop the risk responses is I get the team together and we talk about how can we respond to each risk, and we write a response for each risk on another post-it and stick it to the risk. And I'll show you how to do that in class on Friday. And these are the first order responses that will be refined as the project progresses. And so the following generic responses can be used. So the first response is we can modify our objectives. So you can see that there's this guy crawling through the desert, and it looks like he's very hot and he actually needs water, but he gets to the crossroads and it says fresh water a quarter mile and chicks with great big breasts 21 miles, and so he decides to change or modify his objective because he thinks it's a better opportunity to find chicks with big breasts than to find fresh water. Okay, so this is obviously a joke, but on our projects we might decide, for example, that the risk of using a certain technology is so high that we would rather not use that technology. And that means that we now have to go and change our WBS, our schedule, and our budgets so that the risk will no longer occur. So we're not going down that path anymore. We are changing the direction of the project. Then the next thing to do is to avoid the risk. So in other words, when in doubt, act stupid. So risk avoidance is to eliminate the source of the risk. So to do whatever it takes so that that risk will not occur. And it also boils down to, or a way of avoiding risk is also to micromanage. So if I can get back to my example of a wedding, if we identify a risk is that that it's going to rain, and the reception is meant to be, it's going to rain at the wedding and our guests are going to get wet. So in order to avoid the risk in our wedding invitations, we tell the guests, please bring umbrellas, because that avoids the people from getting wet. Right, then the next way of dealing with the risk is to prevent or transfer the risk. So with prevention, if we use this example, it says, please drive safely. Unmarked nuclear warheads travel these roads. Keep our children radiation free. So if I want to prevent or transfer the risk, I travel on another road. So I don't travel on this road. I find another road that will take me to the same destination. And typically the way that we transfer risks on projects is we take out insurance. So insurance against property damage or personal injury, damage to materials while in transit or storage, breakdown or damage of equipment, theft of equipment and materials, sickness or injury of workers, managers and staff. And then we can also take out forward cover to insure against the exchange rate, fluctuations. So in other words, we're taking a different path, we're transferring the risk, and we're making it the insurance company's responsibility or the bank's responsibility, so that it doesn't harm our project. And you can see that most of these risks are external risks. So these risks are things that we as a project team do not have control over. And because we don't have control over it, we rather transfer it. Then the next way of dealing with risk is to mitigate or reduce the risk. So please God, if you can't make me thin, make my friends fat. So in other words, if my friends are fat and I'm sitting at the table with them and people look at us, they're not going to judge me for being fat, because that's what all my friends look like. And so I have now mitigated the risk of people laughing at me because I'm fat. Right, so how do we reduce risk? We employ the best workers. We use known and tested technology and tools. We do efforts in parallel. Now, in the United States, the military has so much money that they will do whole designs of new jet fighters or new equipment that they need in parallel, where two companies will be working on that design. And that is basically to reduce the risk. Employ strong worker incentives. So in other words, incentivize the workers to make the project succeed. Increase frequency and severity of reviews and tests. Reduce system complexity and use design margins. So if you remember control charts that we spoke about earlier in terms of quality, the design margins are basically our upper and our lower limits that we use on our control charts. So in other words, the design has to fall within certain specifications. Right, and then the next thing that we can do is to develop contingency plans. So when things start going wrong, we don't then only start thinking of ways of solving the problem. We think about it beforehand, once we've identified that this is a risk. So, for example, the cat is hoping, or the cat's contingency plan is that the dog will eat the mouse and not chase the cat. And here is one for people that need their beer. So, in case of emergency, break the glass. So, when I run out of beer, I have plan B. I can break the glass and there are extra beers for me to use. So in order to develop contingency plans, we have to study possible what-if scenarios and develop a plan for each. So you can see contingency plans are not necessarily only one contingency plan. We have to look at what are the different things that could happen and how are we going to deal with each. And then sometimes on a project or in life, to transfer the risk or to develop contingency plans or to mitigate the risk is just so expensive that we just accept the risk. So an example that I like to use here is I think about 5 or 6 years ago a tsunami hit Phuket in Thailand. And due to the tsunami, most of the buildings close to the beach in Phuket, the hotels, etc., were wiped out. And the people of the Phuket then had to rebuild their homes and their hotels and their buildings. Now, I was lucky enough to travel to Phuket for a conference about 2 years after the tsunami happened. And when I got there, I was very surprised because the buildings were actually quite old looking and they didn't look as if they'd just been repaired and rebuilt. And then when I went into it, I realized that these people have just accepted the risk. So they've accepted that if another tsunami happens, they're going to get wiped out again because they cannot afford to build houses and to build hotels, etc., that are tsunami proof. Of course, some of the bigger hotel chains have managed to do that, but a lot of the smaller ones have just said, well, then we rebuild again because we are just accepting that if this happens, this is what we need to do, because it is too expensive to build in order to be tsunami resistant. Okay, and then the whole thing about risk, about treating the risk or developing the risk responses is that throughout you must keep your options open. So don't decide during your risk plan whether you're going to be a dog or whether you're going to be a reindeer. Keep your options open so that you can change your mind and you can follow a different option if the risk maybe doesn't happen or happens in a slightly different manner. So at this stage in the planning phase, we want to identify as many risk responses as possible, and only later on do we want to decide exactly what we're going to do about it. And in the final analysis, if we do not do the process that we've just been speaking about of identifying the risks and evaluating the risks and then developing risk responses, we remain unaware. And if we remain unaware, we're going to be as flat as this possum at the end of the day. And our project is going to fail, and as the project manager, we are going to take the responsibility for that. Right, and then also when you are busy with a project, it's important that you monitor the risk. So you are now in the middle of the, or in the stomach of the snake. So know where you are. Know what are the risks that have happened before and that you don't have to worry about anymore. And know what are the risks that are coming that you still have to worry about. Okay, so your risk response planning is an integral part of project planning, and it must be indicated on your work breakdown structure, it must be indicated on your project schedule, and it must be made allowance for in your project budget. And the same applies for your quality plan, your safety plan, your communications plan, etc., etc. Right, so then the next step is to identify the risk owners. So a member of the project team must take responsibility for each risk. Remember last semester when we were talking about the RAM, or the responsibility allocation matrix, we said that if one person isn't responsible, nothing is going to happen because everybody is going to pass the buck. So for each risk, there should only be one responsible person. And what I normally do is, once we have now put our matrix on the board of which are the risks, what the impact and consequence of each risk is, and we've developed responses for each risk, I give each person a different color sticker, and they then go and stick their sticker on the risk that they take responsibility for. But if you do that, just remember your color key so that you don't ask afterwards, now who was the red one? Okay, because then you lose the impact of what you've done. And if you follow the process like I'm going to show you in class, you will see that it's self-documenting, because at the end of the day, everything is on the board, and as the project manager, you just take that and you write it up as your risk plan. Right, and then remember, compiling the risk register is important, and maintaining it is as important and is often neglected. So we can go through this whole process that we've just been describing of getting to the risk register, but if we don't maintain it and we don't use it, it doesn't actually mean anything to our project at the end of the day. And real-time updating on an intranet is advisable. So if we have a proper project management information system, the PMIS should allow us to update our risks on a regular basis. So in order to have a healthy risk management culture in our organization, we have to admit that risks exist, and we have to be realistic in assessing them. Denial of risks could be fatal. Remember the flat possum. You remain unaware. But the other thing is, we also don't want to exaggerate the risks, because remember what we said when we said sometimes we accept the risk is that risk costs money, or dealing with risk costs money. And by exaggerating the risk and by building in too much fat to cover the risk, we can price ourselves out of the market. And then also acknowledge and make sure that you make it visible to top management that there is always uncertainty that you are not going to be able to identify. So just because you have a risk plan does not mean that Murphy will not strike your project. And then lastly, communicate risks. So your first line of communication is your risk matrix that you set up at the beginning, but keep on updating that and keep on communicating the risks that you identify. Okay, so here is a list of risks. So typically you will have your WBS number. You will then give that the risk is applicable to. You will then give the risk a number so that it's easy to track. You will describe the risk in some way. You will then document the options or the actions that you can take for the risk. The risk will have a status. So if the WBS item has been completed, the status will be complete. If we are now at the point where we are doing WBS item 2.3, then it will become in progress. And if the risk is very far in the future, it will be pending. Okay. And then you can see that there's a responsible person, and then there's a due date, which is basically linked to the due date of our schedule. Okay, and then how do we manage the risks? We discuss them at regular project meetings. We add new risks as they arrive, and we change actions to be taken as appropriate. Because remember that as the project progresses, we get more information on what is going to happen, and that might mean that we want to update some of our risk responses. And then remember, good decisions do not always lead to good outcomes, because we make decisions based on limited information. And later on, with 2020 hindsight, we can often say that the good decisions that we made were bad. But bad luck is not the same as bad management. All right, so if you as the project manager can prove that you did due diligence and you did identify as many risks as possible, and you made decisions based on the limited information, and you asked input, and you escalated things to top management where necessary, you have not done bad management. Okay, but it can be that you've just had bad luck. So project management essentially is risk management, but do not get or create the impression that you have uncertainty under control. Because remember, Murphy is alive and well, and if something can go wrong, it will, and if something can't go wrong, it will anyway. Thank you, and that is the end of risk management, and we will discuss we will do a practical example in class on Friday.